stuck in the band. Stuck in the band. Stuck in the band.
Hello, welcome back. This is
Thank you.
episode 5. I guess I'm doing the lead in here. We're taking a serious detour from Taylor Swift, and we're headed to the land of jazz. And wow, that reflection. Herbie Hancock's third album, Inventions and Dimensions. I'll just say really quick that the genesis for this episode is that I got this beautiful blue note from my friend's gallery, and it was just so pristine and amazing that listened to it a whole bunch, and I was like, well, I'll just do something current. And that was a few weeks ago, so it doesn't feel as current for me right now, but I'm excited to get Mike's thoughts because he's a professional high school trumpeter. And the little blurb on this album is it's the third album recorded on August 30th, 1963 for Blue Note, features Hancock with bassist Paul Chambers, percussionist Willie Bobo, and Chihuahua Martinez. The album was reissued in the 70s as Succotash with the sides reversed. And it's known to have unusual prominent Latin percussion. So there's two, Willie Bobo and Chihuahua Martinez are both Latin percussionists, but apparently the argument is that it's not Latin jazz, which makes sense. It just has two Latin jazz percussionists. So there's quite a range on this album as far as the quartet goes.
A fusion of styles.
Yeah, a real fusion, almost like kind of fusion that might be in, say, Beastie Boys, like Paul's Boutique era.
Oh,
Actually,
interesting.
more on that later while I find that note.
Yeah.
Um,
So tell me, I'm just curious, Casey. I do love jazz, but I am admittedly not as well versed in jazz as I would like to be. And so this was a great pick. I really enjoyed getting to know this album, listened to it many, many times to try to get into it. I am more familiar with 50s jazz, like ensembles where you would have, like, for example, Blue Train by Coltrane, which I know you have feelings about, but that's like my reference is you have the band leader, the one who's on the LP name, and then you have a whole, two or three horns, you have piano, you have bass, you have percussion. So you play the theme, and then everyone gets a chance to improvise on those chord changes, and then the theme comes back around. And that's real.
right.
This is a lot more. It's about 5 years removed from Blue Train, but it feels a lot more experimental.
Yeah.
So
I
can you
think
help me understand like how this album fits in like 1960s and how all that goes?
well, I mean, certainly what you're talking about, the classic jazz era, from what I gather too, not an expert, is that 50s bop leading into essentially that same thing, only harder solos over it called hard bop and then post bop. All kind of sounds kind of silly. It sounds almost like 80s pop music, but it then shifted. There was a shift, and I don't know exactly how pivotal. This certainly is an underrated album. Certainly, Herbie Hancock's not known for this album. The album he's known around this time is Empyrean Isles. This is kind of a deep cut, but all of a sudden it changed to what is more known, made more famous by Coltrane later in The Love Supreme, as well as Miles Davis. Which, gosh, I hope I have this right, but Herbie Hancock was definitely in the Miles Davis quintet for a while. Um, and that would be modal jazz, which I'm going to read my definition of because I don't think I can explain it. I have it here somewhere. Jazz musicians took up modalities because they allowed soloists greater freedom than the more rigid structure of post-war jazz forms like bebop and hard bop. Before modal jazz, compositions were based on tonality, which created a harmonic foundation from chords built from major and minor keys. Solos were simply improvisations of the song's chord progressions. So it's just a true soloing. I mean, it reminds me of like 70s rock or something. They're just doing their own thing, really getting out there. And it's almost like the whole song is a solo, which I think it's more what I think of when I think of jazz, because
Uh-huh.
certainly the biggest albums that everyone knows, if you know anything about jazz, Kind of Blue, Love Supreme, that's modal jazz.
Hmm.
It's just that term is not thrown around a lot yet. And I really think what Herbie Hancock was doing here was he was starting that process too, because he'd been in jazz forever. I have some facts about that. I'm not going to read them at the moment, but
Well, that, if I can interrupt, that is
yeah, yeah,
helpful. The definition of modal is helpful. Like I know that as a musician, like there's different modes you can play in. So
yeah.
like, you might be,
The
like
seven
you
scales,
might be
right?
playing the notes from the C scale, but you're playing them as though D is the tonic. I think that's how it
Yes.
goes. So like in other words, your home base for the key is different, even though you're playing the sharps and flats from the original. And so it creates an interesting mode. It creates an interesting feeling that
Yeah.
doesn't ever quite feel like home. Like you never quite feel like you've arrived at the one,
Yeah.
if you will.
Yeah.
So
You're
that's helpful because, I think about as I was listening to this album, that was what struck me initially. And that's why I listened to it so many times, is I wanted to try to understand it because it sounds a lot like five musicians listening carefully to each other, four, five, listening carefully to each
okay.
other and
Yeah.
hearing, like they'll hear Hancock's piano do a motif and then the drummer will pick up on it. The bassist will pick up on it. All of a sudden we've shifted to a different chord, but it doesn't sound like it was a progression that just repeats and repeats.
Right.
Is that
Yeah. I
fair?
mean, yeah, the music part for me is more difficult. I finally found on my notes where it said modal style of jazz organized around modes, as in scales,
Mhm.
rather than chord. And then there's seven modal scales, which I'm sure you're familiar with. They have Roman names, and each mode is a seven note structure or sequence or whatever. And also, I'm sure you're aware of that. These are things that I'm not as aware of, the Mixolydian or whatever scale or whatever, what is the main guitar one? Um,
Pentatonic.
Pentatonic scale. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, like for example, on this one, I think the first track, Succotash, on Inventions and Dimensions, is I think it's in two different modes. Um, but I wish we could do some clips of sound on this because I played you a clip really early on before recording of a Succotash, and I think it starts off really interesting. Did that just even that snare sound
Mhm.
from I believe uh, Chihuahua Martinez. Did that remind you of anything?
No, it didn't. I have lots to say about Succotash though, but please tell me.
It totally reminds me of, and I would think that these guys would be into it 100%. I think it's Trans Europe Express by Kraftwerk. It sounds like a train. And
Mm.
what would have those guys listened to in Germany at the time? They would have been listening to this music
Hmm.
because it was avant-garde, and
Yeah.
that really drives it home. And then Herbie Hancock comes in that song, and he plays a piano riff. Keep in mind, released in 1963, and it's very short, and it sounds exactly like what would be released next year by Vince Guaraldi for Linus and Lucy, the Charlie Brown theme. It doesn't have the neck. Wait a minute, is that it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah,
I
totally.
thought for a minute I did a different song. It seems like he's riffing off Herbie Hancock. Just
So
those notes.
that came out the
Because he
next
probably
year.
listened to it. Yeah, it was 64, the Charlie Brown album. And that's literally the first 30 seconds of this album. And it's like, okay, people listened to this album and it got stuck in their head and famous albums were made. Both of these are my own listenings. I have not found any confirmation of this on the internet or even looked for it, but I'll let you talk about what some thoughts on some tracks because there's a lot of more interesting stuff.
Well, yeah, so that's interesting. So, and with Succotash for me, like when that piano first comes in, that da 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 da. So it
Yeah.
what I loved about this song is how it messed with my head rhythmically, because when that first riff comes in, I'm feeling like it's in 4/4. It's actually like 6/4. It's like done 2 3 4 1 2 1 2 3 4 1 2. So I'm in that kind of mentality, and then as the song progresses, it changes into a like a 12/8, like a 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 10 11 12 1 2 3 4 5 6 7. So the eighth
Wow.
note, the eighth note has stayed the same from dun 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 dun. Like the eighth note is the same, but all of a sudden you're switching between, which that can happen. Like a good example of that is, of all things, Iris by the Goo Goo Dolls goes between a 6/8 and a 4/4 kind of, and that's kind of what gives it that push pull. I know that's a weird like song to throw out when we're talking about Herbie Hancock, but it just reminded me of like some of the best songs I know of disorient you in that way, where you think they're one thing and then they transform. But I think the fact that there are two percussionists who are keeping that eighth note constant is so fascinating because like so much what like when you hear really good jazz, so much of it is there's the swing, right? There's the dun-
Right, right.
but within that you have the straight, like the soloist is playing straight notes, so da 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 da. So it's the
Yeah,
push pull between the straight notes and the swing.
right,
And
right.
it's the same thing that's happening with going between 4/4 and 6/8. It's like triplets versus doubles. So it's almost like swing versus straight notes as the structure of the song. Anyway, it kind of, that's
It's
why I
very
listen to it.
complex.
It is very complex. And I listened to it again and again and again because I was just trying to wrap my head around what I was hearing. So that was very exciting.
Yeah, this is what I was hoping you would be able to bring insight to because uh, I follow, but only on some degree. I mean, it sounds to me, I mean, this that's the departure there from the 50s classic jazz stuff. What Coltrane was doing with Blue Train versus what Coltrane was doing with A Love Supreme, which from most people's critiques is the greatest jazz album of all time.
Yep.
I think it is pretty great. I think it gets a little boring on side two, but I mean, I like what's going on here with Herbie Hancock, especially for his career, will really take off.
Mhm.
To the point where he was ostracized from jazz because he started getting very modern. He started being like a weather report.
Yep.
When he brought in funk and he brought electro and he had, I have some fun facts and I hope I can get to them all. But I mean, Headhunters was at the time, the highest selling jazz album of all time. And uh, and
Do
here's the
you
really fun fact. I don't want to forget this one. Herbie Hancock also has the only Grammy Award-winning album of the year besides Stan Getz and Zhao Gilberto, the one that everyone knows, The Girl from Ipanema. And that album, his album, the only other album of the year, is River, a tribute to Joni Mitchell. I don't know if you have that one, but it's an album of the year, the only other jazz album of the year, and it's Herbie Hancock's tribute to Joni Mitchell. So there's my fun fact for you, Michael.
okay? That's a very fun fact. I appreciate
Yeah.
it.
And the Grammys,
Cool.
they're always doing their own thing, and another perfect example right there.
Well,
Let us Steely Dan in the 90s or whatever happened. But
it's interesting you bring up Herbie Hancock and kind of what he went on to do and how he was viewed in the jazz establishment. I remember like my first exposure to his music was the 80s stuff. Like remember that song Rocket?
yeah, we're even brought in turntablism. Grandmaster.
Turntables. Yeah,
Yeah.
that was some wild stuff, very contemporary stuff. A
Well, I
lot
mean,
of a lot of artists went that direction during the 80s. You know, you listen to like a Dylan album or a Joni Mitchell album in the 80s and it is I would argue they are mostly unsuccessfully attempting to keep up with the times. Whereas I would see someone like Herbie Hancock's 80s work as it sounds dated now,
right.
but it's different. To me, it fits its time period. Whereas like a Dylan or Mitchell 80s album is like them trying too hard.
Mhm. Yeah, they don't have it. It's like someone's feeding them the ideas or something. I think Herbie Hancock had this ability, even here in 1963, to be. And I actually, one of the first things I wrote for this was that it was Latin jazz. And I later found out that what that really is kind of the people at the time being like, oh, he's got two Latin percussionists. So we're going
Mhm.
to label it Latin jazz. And those two guys are really famous. I mean, I have all the bands that those people went on to be in, like Willie Bobo, whose real name is Willie Correa, no relation to Chick Corea, another famous jazz guy. He started with Mongo Santa Maria, then he went with Cal Jader, then he went on to be in Santana's band. Also, Santana covered his Evil Ways. That's a Willie Bobo track. It's
Hmm.
like can't even follow this stuff basically. And the other guy's famous as well, but I think that's why they got the Latin jazz term, which is
Mhm.
totally erroneous because it's not Latin jazz. It
There
just
are
has,
moments though. There are moments where the song will transform. Like that's what is so rewarding about this. So the second song, Triangle, I thought to me that's the most interesting song on the album. Like it starts out very like conventional swing, like
Mhm.
very lush chords, a subtle melody. Like if you just heard it the first time, you're like, was there a melody? You know what I mean? Uh, but then kind of as you hear the song, like you hear the drummer starting to syncopate more and like um it happens gradually, but then all of a sudden, like in the left channel, you hear I guess it's congas come in, and all of a sudden it really transforms into what I would describe as a Latin groove, where the song started as like a very traditional sounding, straightforward swing. Um, and I found that really interesting how it kind of morphed into this sort of Latin feel. So I would say, like to me, it does sound like a Latin jazz album in places. Maybe not all the
Yeah,
way
oh,
through,
for sure, for sure.
but but yeah, like there's a couple things in this song that I just absolutely loved. Like so the improv, I don't know if this was intentional, but when you listen to Hancock playing, it sounds a lot like it had to be you, like his little motifs. Da 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 da
Playing
da
some
da.
standards.
Yeah, like the standard. And I don't know if that was intentional, but
Yeah,
like that kind of that sense of melody. He'll come up with a motif and then he'll play it a few notes above, a few notes below, and you could
yeah.
just hear them all listening so carefully to each other.
Right.
I also really love the very end of this song when you hear him. He's doing that trill on the top notes. He's going, and then
Yeah, one note.
yeah, right. And then with the left hand, he's doing all the improvising. So there's a lot of really cool stuff happening in that song.
Yes, yes. I unfortunately don't have notes on the songs. I'm not remembering as well, but when you said the trill thing, I was like, okay, good, it's that one. Because I mean, it just sounds on that one hand, it just hitting that one note. And it reminds me of when I sit down at a piano and just, the press of a piano key, it has a certain feel, at a real
Yeah.
piano, not a keyboard. And you
Well,
can
and
just
it's
feel
a
that.
the trill is dissonant. Like I think it's the major seventh up to the eighth, so it's like a half step. So he's
Uh-huh.
going.
Right,
It's not resolving. You know what I mean? It
right.
leaves you very again. There's no sense of home in the music.
Yeah.
It's resolved. Another song I really loved was Mimosa. That one had a bit of a more like traditional chord structure. It's really just going between two chords, mostly from what I could hear. But it actually, to me, it had space to breathe. Like
Mhm.
I was able to kind of that the fact that it was recognizable chords allowed me to kind of take a breath and just really soak in the music. It reminded me of this song that I really love. That if I can give you a tip, because I did listen to your tips last time. There's a
Nice.
song by Wynton Marsalis. I don't know if
Yeah.
it is inspired by this Herbie Hancock album, possibly, but it's called Sunflowers. It's from like 2000. Like it's really
Oh,
late.
wow. Modern. Okay.
But Sunflowers kind of has the same feel to me as this Mimosa track, and I really enjoy it.
Hmm. I am not, unfortunately, remembering Mimosa. It's the fourth track or the second on the B side, I guess.
Mhm.
Maybe it's more of the single. Not that jazz albums have singles, but I know I listened to this album so many times, but I did not. It's harder to make notes on jazz songs.
It is.
It's harder to reference in your head. There's no lyrical melody. And that's part of why I wanted to talk about this, just the broader topic of jazz and get your more knowledgeable. You played in band in high school. I didn't. It's only in the past even decade I've been able to, just about know what any note is on a guitar. Not that I play guitar, but I don't have that background so it's interesting. But I got to get this tidbit in here. The one I
Hey,
hinted at super early when I was going off about how this craft work and Vince Guaraldi inspired. A really interesting thing again about Willie Correa is that his youngest son, Eric Bobo, that's what it says on Wikipedia. Eric Correa is a percussionist with the crew Cypress Hill. He also performed on the Beastie Boys' 1994 album Ill Communication. So there you have it. Just
that Bobo on the
modern
corner.
science. Yeah, I guess so. Yeah, which
Cool.
is crazy. I mean, this lineup, and I haven't said anything about poor Paul Chambers, but he's on the upright, what they call in jazz the double bass. I don't actually know why it's called that because it's so low. Um, and he was in the Miles Davis quintet as well.
Yep.
So this is no slouch on bass.
Mhm. Well,
You know,
to keep up with what Hancock is doing, I mean, the interplay between the two of them is in some ways the magic of this record.
yeah, yeah, they're the foreground, and then the two percussionists are really providing the rhythm in the background.
Mhm.
Uh, I think it's a lineup. I don't know if this kind of lineup was done in jazz at this time or was ever done again.
Mhm.
Uh, but it is a unique, and doesn't it make you think of like Paul's Boutique?
Kind
Like the
of.
Beastie Boys, those kind of unsung guys, Mario C and the other guy, they were doing what Hancock is doing here with hip hop.
Yeah, that's true.
Insane to think about. And Paul's Boutique and also Check Your Head wouldn't be what they are. And Ill Communication is not as interesting to me, but I
Yeah,
mean, that
it's a
lineup, that idea.
it's an essential part. And even when you see the Beastie Boys live
Oh
performances
yeah,
during that time, those guys are there.
oh yeah, they're a major part. It's Mario C and I'm gonna feel bad, man.
Caldado, Mario
Yeah,
Caldado.
Mario
Mario
Cadeta,
C can't front on that.
and then the other guy's Japanese, right?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So I mean, that's actually
Money
bringing,
Mark.
yeah, money. That's bringing in Money Mark Nishida, right?
Yeah,
They're
yeah.
bringing in, technically they're bringing elements of Latin percussion and Japanese. It's amazing because I'm not going to say if we're going to be doing a krautrock album anytime soon, but we might. Um, I've been I've been really saddened with the passing of Damo Suzuki from Can, which he was on my favorite three albums, Japanese singer. But anywho, um,
Well, can I say something real quick? So
yes,
I just want like thank you for suggesting this album. This was great and I really enjoyed it. And I listened to it, like I said, a bunch of times, not just because I wanted to talk about it, but like really enjoyed it and found it very challenging. Um, you mentioned Love Supreme. I actually, my favorite jazz album is probably like if I were just to pick one up and play it, check out Lush Life by Coltrane. It was
okay,
something that like the label put out after he died, I think, and it wasn't even like a real album, but it was sort of like a bunch of stuff that was left over put together. Very, very good. Lush Life.
interesting,
Yep.
really. Hmm.
Lush. So what else? We
Um,
good time?
let's see. I dropped the Willie Bobo fine there.
Have any other fun facts before I reveal our next one?
Let's see. Paul Chambers was on Kind of Blue. He was very instrumental in first track So What, which of course everyone knows. That's
Yep.
the probably the most famous Modal song. And then prominent duetted many albums with Bill Evans. Um, I don't have as much for Osvaldo Martinez, but I'd like to point out that is Cuban. He was proficient in the congas, bongo. So these are what he's playing on here: congas, the bongos, the guero, which is that little like
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
might be the opening to this, and as well as finger cymbals. And I don't know if timbales too, but I think he probably sits fourth string to this lineup. It's pretty safe to say, but I mean, this lineup is very serious. And yeah, Herbie Hancock worked with Donald Byrd, Miles, most known for Headhunters, which brought in the ARP, that crazy. It's almost like a primitive sampler, almost like the Mellotron, I think, or maybe it's
Uh,
just a weird keyboard like a Moog. I hate saying Moog. I swear it's Moog. There's even that one. There's even that one Moog album where it has a cow on it and it says Moog. Well, why would a cow say Moog? So I leave it. That's you people always changing the language of English. Well, English has no sounds for its vowels. It's dependent upon the other language that it came from. So there, you grammar people.
Hmm.
Uh, it's true. It's very true. Vowels, you make up vowels, or it's like jazz, right? It depends on your region. From what part of the United States you're from is how you play those vowels. How many vowels are there? Five, maybe six. That's like notes, right?
Hmm.
Deep thoughts here at the
Deep
end.
thoughts from Casey.
It's kind of true.
Yeah, it
It's
is. It's good.
I mean, when you spend time overseas or anything in the UK, you're like, man, they mispronounce everything, everything. But they're not mispronouncing anything. It's actually technically us mispronouncing
Hmm. Of
everything.
course it is.
If anything, it's us.
Mhm.
But anywho, do you think that there's a serious do you think Vince Guaraldi listened to this album and wrote the Peanuts theme?
Well, now that you mentioned it, it is an interesting coincidence, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well,
it's
is it
it's
time for me
there.
to reveal our next one, Casey?
Yes, yes.
All right, next up. So I have to confess, I've never owned this album in my life,
No worries, no worries.
but I've always loved this album, and I just, it's unlike my previous picks, but I love it just the same. It is, are you ready? This is terrible.
Oh, okay,
Blood,
right. Right.
Sugar, Sex, Magic by the Red
Okay.
Hot Chili Peppers.
1990.
Yeah, no,
Look at that.
91.
91. The album
91.
cover that inspired a whole decade of bad tribal tattoos.
There's a lot to say about this one. It'll be fun. So
Sure, sure. Looking
enjoyed it,
forward.
Casey.
I don't have it on vinyl or CD, so we're just off in the modern Spotify world,
We're
I
gonna
guess.
stream it. It's gonna be great.
Yep.
All
All
right.
right,
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
perfect. Awesome.